And welcome to the opening of day 3 of this year's Agile Online Summit. I'm Ines Garcia, and with Helen Garcia, we'll be your host for the remaining of this summit. We are both passionate Agile professionals amongst many other adventures we get up to, and we have a packed schedule ahead of us. Over 3 hours of content. We are running multiple different content tracks in parallel. And the themes of this year are tools, so we can equip and be better prepared, sustainability, so that we can leave the place better than how we found it. And that's product, people, planet, happiness, because life is perishable. So do what you love and love what you do. Then we have the track of life, hands-on sessions, so roll up your sleeves, as well to the coaching clinic. As you know by now, we are using Slack as a hub for sessions, conversations, and connections. That's during and beyond this summit. So if you haven't yet, head over there right now. You have the link in the several email comms. Check the channels 1 to 6, and that includes all tracks. And right now, hop over the track sustainability channel and ask your questions to today's keynote speaker.
Thank you, Ines. Linda Aspey is with us today, bringing the all-important topic that marries our passion for Agile and the importance of coaching and how we can support the complex topic of sustainability. The planet is changing. It always has been, and it always will. But it's now a pivotal point in our lives that we can make a change for the better. How we, as individuals, can influence the masses, influence our teams, our neighbours, our friends, and our family. Influence to evolve in building a better planet, a better culture of change to become more sustainable. It's a journey that we as Agilists have the opportunity to embrace as organisational change agents with a difference. Now, Linda, thank you for joining us here today at the Agile Online Summit. It's really wonderful to have you on board. You are well known for your work with taking a positive action on culture, climate, environmental and social change, and that's really why we reached out to you. These 4 elements we need to talk about, and we need to have the tools and the confidence within our Agile teams to make change happen. Without further ado, I welcome Linda Aspey to the stage.
Thank you very much, Ines and Helen. What a lovely introduction. So today I'm going to be talking to you about Agile skills for complex sustainability challenges. We'll take about 40 or so minutes. So what we'll cover is we'll be talking about the context and the ecological crisis and the climate crisis, what we're actually in. We'll have a look at some of the challenges that we all face in addressing it, and at the role that the businesses can and are playing, and how Agile coaching skills can support. And then at the end, we'll look at some next steps and resources. So I'd like to tell you a bit of a story, if I may. I'm a coach, and I've been a facilitator and a therapist as well. And I've worked in this field of development, organisation and personal and team development for around 30 years or so. And since 2019, I specialised in supporting organisations and individuals facing into this climate crisis and this ecological crisis. And it all began for me 4 years ago in 2019, in the spring of 2019, when I was finishing up working with a team. I'd worked with a business intelligence team for a couple of days on an offsite. And I finished and got into the car, ready to drive home. And I caught the tail end of a radio documentary about birds and butterflies and insects and extinction. And I'd like to have thought in the past that I was quite sort of switched on about the environment. I've lived to some extent, a relatively low carbon life, or in the past, I've certainly done more than my fair share of emissions. But for the last few years, I've been a little bit more aware. But as I began to listen to this documentary, and it really was the tail end of it, and they started talking about the decline of butterflies in the Netherlands, of all places. Now, I haven't been to the Netherlands. I think I had rather an idyllic view, that it was full of tulips and beauty. And of course, it might be full of tulips, but that's mostly monoculture, and it's very, very industrial in parts of the Netherlands. But they talked about this statistic that the Netherlands had lost 84% of its butterflies in the past 130 years. And that statistic really hit me. I don't quite know why that statistic hit me more than any other, obviously, apart from the enormity, because when we hear about things declining, we hear about things by small percentages, 5 or 10% losses. But 84% seemed to me to be at least totally staggering. And I started to drive off to come back home, but I realized I was actually crying. And I had to pull the car over, and I did have a good wail, and I just cried. And it felt like a massive moment when I truly did let the enormity of what's going on in our world sink in. I mean, it truly was a sort of butterfly moment. And it's one of those moments that I often hear from other people who've had a sort of climate awakening, and they say that they remember the time when something really hit them and they can't go back. And that's very much my story. It really was. I'd like to have thought I was environmentally friendly before, but this was certainly a transformation moment for me. And so I spent the next few days, actually, and weeks, in a state of shock, quite traumatized, because that weekend I'd gone home and I started going on the internet and just looking what was going on. How come I did not know about how bad some of these things were? How come I didn't know about all of this decline? And then when I started digging deeper into things like climate change, and I thought, well, I'd heard I've heard in the past that we've got 12 years. But what does that really mean? It doesn't mean much to people. And we'd hear things like even scientists where we have 12 years to reduce greenhouse gases. It didn't really register terribly much, apart from thinking about the ozone layer in our refrigerator and things like that. So I'd never taken it as seriously as I should have done. I realised a lot of people hadn't. And it could be for many, many reasons, and we'll come on to some of those later. But so I walked around in a state of quite some trauma for the next few weeks, going out for walks in nature, realising that there weren't as many flies around, that I didn't see as much wildlife, that the seasons were different and changing. And I felt quite alone with it. And luckily, I was able to eventually find some friends in the coaching profession who equally had had the same sort of wake-up moment and wanted to do something about it, but didn't know what. So I took myself off to various schools, including the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, to understand what was going on a little bit more and to see how I could apply my skills to working with leaders in this field, and various other courses that I did, all of which were incredibly useful. But I think they were mostly in a sort of manic defense of I've got to find out everything, I've got to know, I've got to be a scientist. If I'm going to talk about this, I have to be really credible, all that kind of stuff. And I now realize probably I needed less than I thought, though I'm glad I did go through some of those trainings. So I started started a movement with others where 3 people founded the Climate Psychology Alliance, and I was one of their founding members. So I mean, the Climate Coaching Alliance, I was already a member of the Climate Psychology Alliance by that stage, but 3 people founded the Climate Coaching Alliance, and I got very involved in that as one of its first members. I also became an activist with Just Stop Oil, a first-time activist, but I felt I wanted to do something that hadn't been done, nothing had been done to a level to get us to a safe place. So that's what I did, and I now actually work a lot with Just Stop Oil, and I'm not here to debate the rights and wrongs of activism. You can all make your own choices, and I'm not here to enroll anybody, though of course, should you choose to join an activist movement, that's really up to you, and I would encourage it, if nothing else, for the sense of community that you do get, because it's certainly an antidote to the loneliness that I felt in knowing what I knew when it seemed like the rest of the world wasn't talking about it. And I also write quite widely now on climate change, so I'm a columnist for the climate coaching columnist for Coaching at Work magazine, and various other things as well. So I work mostly now with organisations and people that really want to find out what they can do and how. I'm not going to tell them what to do, I'm just going to coach them through that. So here actually is the actual headline that I found in the newspaper when I went back. In fact, on the internet, I found it from the BBC's website about butterfly numbers falling. So it was pretty horrific, really, to see that in the real flesh. And I'd like to say something about the term climate change before I move on, because climate change is a term that seems to be quite widely used, but it means a lot of things to different people, and it encompasses a lot. And you could include in that both climate, ecological damage, societal damage, whole planetary damage, and mostly as well, it's a system. It's about injustice. It's about unfairness. It's about people and humans and non-humans who've done the least to cause it are suffering the most. So climate change is a catch-all term, really, and it's really symptomatic of a deep and wide malaise we have in our relationship with our planet and how we live now. And that includes quite widely a loss of connection to nature for many people, particularly in the so-called developed world, that we're not so much in tune with nature as we used to be. And it's not just about energy. Obviously, we're going through an energy crisis at the moment in many parts of Europe and in fact in the world. It's about biodiversity and pollution. So climate change is that kind of catch-all term, and it does impact all life forms, human and non-human. And really importantly, I should say that it's a multiplier of all forms of social disadvantage. So if, for example, you have a mental health problem, you are much more likely to be impacted by the physical impacts of climate change and the emotional impacts of climate change than if you didn't. So if you have dementia, for example, you may not realize that you're very thirsty during a heat wave. If you are ill, disabled, you can't move yourself as quickly away from danger. If you're poor, you're going to be breathing in dirtier air because you're living in a dirtier area full of pollution. You may have less access to good food. You may be female. Females suffer much more widely around the world than men because they generally tend to be the ones that do the child caring and do the vegetable growing, and they feed others before they feed themselves. So it extracts from and impacts the most people who are most vulnerable and who've done the least to cause it. In fact, in the global south, around 88% of the world's population, that is, they only account for about 8% of the climate crisis. So 88% account for 8% of the climate crisis. And the cost of that is that they will pay is estimated to be about $571 billion. And that was in 2010. And that is set to rise to 92% of the global population paying 8% of the cost, which will be $954 billion by 2030. So what we do in developed worlds impacts those people significantly. And of course, it impacts nature in many, many ways. And it's very complex. And so it needs us to take a systemic mindset and approach. So I'd like to ask you, how concerned are you about climate change? Is a scale, you might want to write some numbers down. So between a scale of 0, which is not concerned at all, to 10, how concerned are you about it? Now, if you find yourself feeling not particularly concerned, it's quite normal, actually. Some people say, well, on some days, I don't know. I don't know enough about it. I think there's nothing I can do. I don't think about it much. So sometimes people score 2, 3, 4. Sometimes you might think about it and score higher. I'm not going to judge what you score. They're all part of the human condition in dealing with this massive problem, this wicked problem, as you will know that term in Agile. So how concerned are you? Write that down if you would, because we're going to refer back to these numbers at the end of this presentation. And do you think that we, that's governments, industry, individuals, are doing enough to combat and overcome climate change? And thirdly, on that scale of 0 to 10, would you like to do more to address it? And if you would, but you don't know where to start, well, I'm glad you're here. And hopefully by the end of this session, you'll have some better ideas about where you can play your part, and a very valuable part too, I believe. So first of all, I want to just show you the context that we are in an emergency and we are absolutely way off track in addressing it. You can see here that this graph starts from 1960, but actually our CO2 levels started rising in the industrial era, industrial revolution in around the mid to late 1800s. And around 1960s, it was thought that a safe level of carbon dioxide in the environment was around 350 parts per million. And we were aware that our industrial use, our fossil fuels, our living, our lifestyle was adding carbon dioxide to the environment. And carbon dioxide is one of the many greenhouse gases that heats the environment and creates an extra duvet around our environment. We've only got 7 miles to protect us between that and the rest of outer space. And it's putting another duvet around, and there's nowhere for it to go. So the levels just kept rising. And you see here that there was an agreement in Kyoto in the late 1990s. I can't remember the exact year. I think it was 99 actually, to reduce CO2. And yet look at this trajectory, we're still going up. And then we had what's called the Paris Agreement, still going up. That was 2015-16. That's still going up. And we just had a global agreement in Glasgow last year, and it's still going up. So none of these global issues, global meetings, and the good and the great getting together is doing enough to change the trajectory. And in fact, the amount that's been financed by banks in fossil fuel industries is now, in the last few years, $3.8 trillion. So the money is still being poured in to fossil fuels. Of course, there are some wonderful initiatives happening, and we'll talk a little bit about some of those. But you can see the trajectory. The evidence is clear. We're on this upward slope and nothing's stopping it. This is known, that curve before up the graph is called the hockey stick curve. And we see hockey stick curves wherever we look in recent years. We see it in world population, in GDP, in fertilizer consumption, in paper production, how much water we use. So it was a slow thing, and then it suddenly went up. And if you look at, maybe think about your own life, if you've been alive 200 years ago, and you compare, for example, the number of shoes you now have to what you would have had 200 years ago, the amount of food you eat, the amount of choice you have, all sorts of things that would be upward on a trend of the hockey stick curve. The same with the Earth systems. Carbon dioxide is going up. Oceans are acidifying more. Another hockey stick curve. We're using more and more domesticated land. Only a tiny percentage of our land now is left to be wild, and very, very small number of animals are actually now deemed as wild. It's a tiny proportion, tiny percentage. So this hockey stick curve is absolutely everywhere. And this period has been known as the Great Acceleration, also known as the age of the Anthropocene, when mankind is making a bigger impact on the whole planet than any other creature that's living. And we're going to come on to some more of that as well. And you'll see here that since 2011, there's been 262 extreme weather events, which have been attributable to climate change, that have evidence of human influence. And you can, this is a website called Carbon Grief, and you can have a look around that. I said that was a Freudian slip, carbon grief, but it is full of grief. There are people all over the world struggling and suffering at this very moment as we sit here. And we don't, as yet, in the Western world, feel as much of it, but we certainly are starting to, and that will continue. So you can see that there's been some extreme weather events, and in fact, there's all kinds of effects that the climate change is having. We're having a loss of biodiversity, which was my butterfly moment. So all sorts of life systems and the web of life are being compounded by different climates changing, and the weather patterns changing over long periods of time. We've always had weather patterns, we've always had changes in the environment and changes in the atmosphere, but this is the first one that they've been able to prove has been, incontrovertibly, is caused by human action. You can look at the fossil fuel records, you can look at all sorts of records as to what's happened before in previous things like ice ages, and those have not been at the hand of humans. So we've got more frequent and more extreme weather patterns. Again, we've had weather changes. These are now much more frequent, much more extreme. We are now facing uninhabitable lands. There are 800 million people likely to be displaced from their homes by the end of the century. That's a massive proportion. 800 million is just incredible numbers of people that won't be able to live where they live now. And of course, all of this is affecting food and water security. And on top of that, of course, we've got lots of other crises going on, which many of you have been dealing with. COVID, we're all dealing with energy crises, mortgage crises, cost of living crises, all those kind of things are all happening at the moment. So it's all compounded. And of course, we've got massive pollution, absolutely massive, impacting our land, our seas, our air, everything is being impacted. And that's not directly linked to climate change, but it is linked to a sort of wider malaise on our planet. So, however, there is some good news. This was caused, this growth, this great acceleration was actually enabled by business. And we've had some very good things come out of this incredible growth we've had. We've had incredible advances in healthcare, in longevity, in education, in understanding, in science, in all sorts of things, in arts, in so many fields, and of course in technology. We've had some really fantastic things, but the downsides are now beginning to outweigh the upsides in many, many people's lives. But this growth was enabled by business, so the remedies can be enabled by business. So that gives us hope that actually we can really make a difference here. So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to share a short film with you. I'm just going to stop this share now. And I'm just going to go to another screen, which is a screen I've got ready for you to have a look at a video. It's just 5 minutes.
To the Anthropocene, the age of humans. We are now the dominant force of change on the planet.
Nature once determined how we survive. Now we determine how nature survives.
3/4 of the land surface and 2/3 of the ocean are impacted by our activities. In the summer, there is 40% less Arctic sea ice cover than there was in 1980. Almost half of our planet's forests have been felled for their timber and to make space for ourselves and our livestock. And at sea, our extensive overfishing is leading to the collapse of key fish stocks.
The cod stocks crashed back home in Newfoundland, where I was from. And, thousands of people thrown out of work, boats beached, canneries emptied. And that was the real wake-up call. That's where I began to understand that there'll be no jobs on a dead planet.
The destruction of our natural world is already costing us trillions of dollars every year. Suddenly, the costs of the age of humans are outweighing the benefits.
We are at risk of entering a danger zone where we could trigger irreversible and self-amplifying change which could push the whole planet ultimately away from the desired equilibrium. We're at risk of destabilizing the whole planet.
We have just 10 years to drastically alter our path before it will be too late to avoid catastrophic changes to our planet.
We need revolutionary speed, right? We need a green revolution, and it needs to happen at the scale and at the speed of the digital and internet and mobile revolution.
And what drove the speed and scale of these revolutions? Business. The same force that powered the last period of global change can also power the next.
The business sector has no option but to be a force for change.
Successful businesses will embrace the clean technologies that now exist.
Are we going to run out of wind and sunshine in Texas before we run out of fossil fuels? I'm betting on wind and solar. First and foremost, I'm a businessman, and the original decision was it was a business decision.
New ideas and land management strategies will help us protect our biodiversity and feed more people with less land. The health of the ocean is critical to the way our planet operates. Future businesses will respect it as a resource that belongs to all of us, only taking what it can naturally replace. Next generation businesses will design their product lines to fit within circular economies.
Waste from one process becomes food for the next. Waste is just a resource in the wrong place. That's even true for carbon dioxide. It's true for plastics. It's true for everything that we think we're throwing away. There is no away. And so we need to create economies that actually have infrastructure that enable that circular design.
If you ask millennials, what is the purpose of business? 47% said some version of the purpose of business is to improve society and protect the environment. This is a fundamental sea change in the way an entire generation thinks about business. It's going to mean that if you want to attract the top talent and retain them, if you want to win over millennial customers and attract the $30 trillion of capital that's currently being given to millennials by the baby boomer generation, you're going to have a narrative around how your products are sustainable and healthy.
Sustainability is now the only business plan.
I think that in the future, when we look back, there will be two types of companies. Companies that got it and companies that didn't get it. I know which segment I'd like to belong to.
The only viable future is one in which business innovates to demand less of our world. In that future, the wild will recover. We can restore the balance of nature, fix the relationship between our planet and our business, and change the way we live on our planet for the better. Forever.
So I hope you found that enlightening. That was a beautiful film by the World Wildlife Fund, which does allow anyone to watch that if you just get in touch with them and share it. Something I just want to say before we move on to your thoughts about that is that I don't, and many others don't think that just, for example, all those pictures of solar panels. I don't think that this is just a case of swapping one kind of exploitation for another. We've exploited resources massively. We've overconsumed resources massively. So I think we need a very different approach. And the reference there was made to the circular approach. So whatever we do cannot still perpetuate the same patterns of harm that we have been, that happened because we use fossil fuels. You can't just replace one bad for another, one set of exploitations with another. So that's just something I want to flag up there. But I'd like to invite you now just to pause for a moment and if you're watching this on demand and you're watching this on video, you might want to make some notes at this point and think about what role might you play in this healing of our world? How's all this hitting you? What skills do you have? What kind of skills might an agile mindset provide here? What role can agile play in what businesses need and are trying to do at the moment? Because the challenges are absolutely huge. They are many. So just have a few minutes for reflection if you want to. So the challenges are huge. Well, first of all, it's global. This is global and it's very fast moving and it's complex. It's a wicked problem, which doesn't have one solution and is interconnected and it's networked and it's all of those other things. One thing is interdependent on another. It's a system. It's a whole system and it's a system within systems. And we've had some lies, we've had some powerful forces, invested interests with money behind. So just follow the money. That makes it even more challenging because where there's money, there's power. And that also has meant many times we've had a lack of information and a loss of trust. So we don't know who to trust anymore in our leaders. We have limited experiences tackling such big issues. This is global and it's all of those things. We've had some experience with COVID and that's probably done some, we've learned a lot from that. But one thing about COVID is we could have vaccinations against that and we could see the end of it, light at the end of the tunnel. There is no vaccination against climate change and there's nowhere to be. We can't hide from it. We can hide from it for a while, but it will completely, it's there for everybody. It's not something we can bury ourselves in a cave for long, unless you're Elon Musk and pop yourself into space for a while. Generally, our elected leaders aren't leading well on it, so we don't know who to trust, and there isn't a very strong sense of leadership around the world. And we are psychologically defended against it. All of us are. When I first encountered it, I was just amazed at who wasn't talking about it. How come it wasn't being talked about every day in the news? This is so serious. Why aren't we talking about the potential demise of everything we love? but we're psychologically defended. It's too big. We feel guilty. We don't know what to do. We minimize it. We say, well, what about China? They're bigger than us. Why should I sort myself out if they're not? But these are all defense processes that we use to protect ourselves from the enormity of it. And for some people in the planet, and for us, sometimes on a day-to-day basis, we are humans, and our desire to conserve our way of life is sometimes greater than the desire to conserve life itself. So our challenge actually is not necessarily a challenge of means. We have the means, but do we have the will and the sustained will? And one of the biggest challenges we face is something that's known as, in some circles, as a socially constructed silence. And it's one of the things that has made it very hard to talk about, because the socially constructed silence is a tacit agreement not to talk about something, and it's established through verbal and non-verbal cues. You know, you go to a party at the weekend and you start talking to somebody about climate change, they're certainly going to move away from you quite quickly unless they happen to be somebody who's interested in it. But generally it's not a topic of conversation, and we get little, it's a bit awkward, don't raise that here. So activists get it all the time, in extremists, of course. And it's a way to make a topic or make denial, to avoid a topic or make denial of social norm. Now, there have been many of those before, you know, around gender, sexuality, equality, all sorts of things. But this is more global, more widespread in the places which aren't yet suffering from it. And I use those words, aren't yet, very deliberately, because in some places where you have no choice but to confront it, it's on your doorstep, literally. It's taking food away from you and your children, and it's lapping up your doors with floods. And it's the way to make the repression of thoughts about a topic a default behavior, so it becomes the norm, so the avoidance of it can continue indefinitely. So it's kind of don't ask, don't tell stuff. And then people become afraid to violate this social norm, because when was the last time you actually had a conversation with somebody about climate change? And because the often association with that is that someone's going to give you a lecture on what you're doing wrong, and you're going to feel bad because you're a hypocrite. And even if you might have given up meat or still have, meat-free Mondays or something, you feel it's small and you can't even raise the subject of climate change and all that goes with it without feeling like or being seen as a hypocrite. Because none of us are currently living perfect lives unless you've taken yourself off to a cave. And well, even then you're not, because you're probably wearing some clothes that were made out of it, or you've got there by some transport means. So we live in a society that makes it really, really hard to live an ecologically clean life, so to speak. So it becomes very, very difficult to do that. But a way of looking at this is through the lens of the eyes of a lady called Joanna Macy, who's now in her 90s, but she developed some work called The Work That Reconnects, and she developed this for activists back in the 40s, 50s, 60s. Sorry, not 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, around climate change, but most particularly then around nuclear, the threat of nuclear, and also around indigenous oppression and taking lands and those kind of things. So she looked at what we were living through then, and these stories are still as valid as now as they were then. And the first story that we are living at the moment is business as usual. This is the work that keeps us going. This is what we do on a day. There's a defining assumption that little really needs to change, that the resources we've got on the planet are infinite, and so we can continue to exploit and extract and consume. And then actually the infinite growth is desirable, not just possible, but desirable. And that's obviously in the UK. If you're a UK citizen watching this, you'll know that there's a big controversy at the, or has been, in about growth and infinite growth. The second story of our time is the Great Unravelling. And this is a story that highlights the disasters that this business as usual scenario is leading us to. And it can lead us to feel like everything's falling apart. We're doomed, there's no point in trying, and it's just too hard, and all of that. It's overwhelming. There's so much going wrong right now. It's hard sometimes to think that anything's going right. And that story is playing hand in hand with business as usual. and at the same time, the third story. There is a third story, and it's called the Great Turning. And it could be a story where we move and make a transition from an industrial growth society, one, that's just committed to economic growth, instead to something that's a life-sustaining society that is committed to the healing and recovery of our world. We don't focus on quality of life as a measure of success. We focus on GDP at the moment, for example, in many countries. So is this a moment where we can think, well, okay, these three stories are playing out, and I can find myself in one of these stories at any point in the day. It's not that I'm fixed on a story. I want to go into business as usual when I feel like buying a new dress, and then I realize actually I've already got 2 dresses like that. I just don't need that, or I don't need another jacket or another pair of shoes, or but we can default into business as usual. And it's really a case of which story you want to choose. You can play deathbed attendance. You can say, well, it's all going wrong and there's nothing we can do about it, and let's watch it all go. Or do you want to be part of midwifing a new era? And I think the second is much more positive. And of course, if you had a child who was very ill, let's say, for example, and I hope that people here watching haven't had a child that's very ill or lost a child. But if you know somebody that's been like in that situation, and an expert said to them, your child's in a really serious condition, we don't know if they're going to make it, what would you say? Would you say, well, yeah, okay, then we might as well just give up? Of course you wouldn't. Of course you wouldn't. You'd say, well, okay, you might think we're doing, but what can we do, and who can we talk to, and who can we bring in here, and what experts do we need, and what about the expert in me, and what can I do? We would find ways to do whatever we could. That's called active hope. It doesn't mean undue optimism. It doesn't mean say it'll all be fine. It's say, what can we do? What part can I play? So we do have a chance to do something here. And they're very similar rituals, deathbed attendance or midwifery, where they're passing from one state to another, and they both require care and attendance. But I'd prefer to midwife something. And for midwifing this new era, we need people with skills to lead and coach and have great conversations at all kinds of levels. So I want to move on now to a bit more around business and thinking about some of these sustainable development goals. You may have heard of these. These are 17 goals that the United Nations put together across all walks of life, across all areas of life, from our food to how we manage our land, to the way we care for the land, the way we consume, the way we build, the way we eat, the way we grow, the way we educate. So there's some very clear goals here. And many businesses are working with these goals. Not all necessarily all 17 are valid, but it's quite overwhelming, isn't it? It's quite a lot going on there of things that you could focus on. But these really are just signposts. And other organisations now are looking at this from an economic and a environmental and a social governance stance. The ESGs, you might hear some of this terminology: environmental, social, and governance. And these really are just markers of how you can measure how you're doing against the Sustainable Development Goals in these areas, environmental, social, and governance. And another way of looking at it really is, before I move on, just there's so much jargon: sustainability, emissions, GRI, offsets, IPCC, carbon credits, net zero. There's so many things. But once you've got your head around them, and you're pretty good at jargon in Agile, once you've got your head around them, you can actually develop a whole familiarity with this language. Because really what it's all about is the triple bottom line of people, planet, and profit. People for social performance. How are we doing around people? And that includes people around the world, not just us in our little bubble here. How are we doing on how we're impacting on the planet? What's our performance there? And how are we doing in terms of how we make profit, or how we make reserves if you're a charity? What's our economic performance? And in the heart of that then is, how do we make these sustainable and not just one-hit wonders when we do well? So if we look at that in a different way, it's really about making decisions. How do we make decisions about where we work, where our employees are based, how we work with our clients, who we buy from in our supply chain, how we help others in our communities. And you might have also heard about scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. These slides will be available for you afterwards, and there'll be some notes and resources, by the way, I should have said. So you've got direct emissions from your operations, and you could sort of, that's what you burn directly, your fleet, your cars, that kind of thing. That's scope 1. You can control that quite easily if you put some effort into it. Scope 2 is indirect emissions, what you buy in, the electricity you use to heat your offices, to cool your buildings, your production processes, all that kind of stuff that is indirectly from the energy you buy in. And thirdly, scope 3. And these are actually the hardest to control because these are things that happen down the supply chain, and they're associated with your activities, but not necessarily, you can't have that direct an impact on them. You can, for example, around business travel, but employees commute, you can't necessarily, unless you said you won't have employees commuting more than 100 miles a day to reach you, can't control that. And it's also how you manage your operations, how you dispose of waste, where that waste goes to, what happens when you put your stuff in this magical place called away, who looks after that away, and does it really get sent to where you think it's going to, or is it getting sent to the Manila or somewhere else in, that's luckily being banned now, but where is it all going? So how do you control that? How do you control if you make things from cotton? How do you control how the workers are treated and how all of that? So, and where you invest your money, your pension funds, where you invest where you buy your stocks and shares from, what's in those chains. So that's burn, buy and beyond. And so what can businesses do about it? Well, there's an organisation called Business Declares, which I'm a member of, where people have declared a climate and ecological emergency, and we've made pledges to do certain things. And that's where, again, Agile is going to come in, is because you're going to be really good at helping some of these things happen. So the things that they recommend is to raise awareness, first of all, to start those conversations, to break those socially constructed silences whenever you can, and to make all your business decisions through the lens of climate change and biodiversity. So whatever you do, how is this going to impact the environment? How is this going to impact the other beings on the world? And some could take it further and impact how is it going to impact future generations? To undertake a rapid decarbonisation of your business with using offsetting as a last resort, that's just putting off. That's just trading against the other. It's better to have a clean sweep and use offsetting as an absolute last resort, and decide on what your red lines are. What will you do? What won't you do? Who will you do business with? Who will you not? Where will you invest? Where will you not? And implementing circularities. At the moment, most of what we do goes in a straight line, from the shop into the bin and then landfill. So, how are we going to implement circularity in all we do? And how do we move away from destructive industries that are killing the planet and the environment into much more productive ones? And how do we, as businesses, speak out to wider audiences using the platform, which is one of the things that I do. I do a lot of talks about this, and I write widely about it because I want to reach out beyond my direct customers. So I was talking with some business leaders, and I also spoke to the director of business at Business Declares, Ben Tolhurst, and I asked him, what are the top 6 challenges that you're encountering in the people that you speak with? And they resonate very much with my own experience. So I've got them here. But the one I would just add, by the way, of the business action, that is just to join with others. There are so many initiatives happening out there, and it's about collaborating, sharing, learning and supporting. And guess what? Agile are really good at doing. Agile is all about collaborating and sharing and learning each iteration of what you do and supporting and constantly revisiting that iteration. How did that work? What's next? What's next? Who else do we need to talk to? Who else should we ask? What are the user experiences like? So this is something that all businesses could learn a lot, actually, from Agile about how you've always done things. So these business leaders' top sustainability challenges, feeling overwhelmed. You might already be feeling overwhelmed by this very presentation, thinking this is huge. Where do you start? Business leaders want to know where to start, wanting to do the right thing. But where to start and how do you keep the business going day to day? Well, I would say that in Agile project management, you're pretty used to some of that because you're often implementing changes whilst trying to keep business going as usual. So if they can learn from you, I think anyone, they could learn from you on this. And secondly, knowing how to measure your carbon footprint. You've got, if you're going to change something, you need to have some measurements in the first place, and where to find the tools, which tools to use. As an Agile practitioner, you'll have plenty of tools already at your disposal. And there's so many more out there that you can bring to bear in working with sustainability that will be second nature to you, some of those tools. How to manage the admin, how to manage the flow, how to manage projects in incremental steps, all of those things. How to work out where you get the best results, you know, the best bang for your buck actions, and how to do that. You know, where do you start? Changing your energy policy, your supply, your bank, your travel policy. What do you do? So trying to work out that. And as I mentioned before, dealing with scope 3 emissions is a massive challenge for businesses because it's out of often their direct control, or so they think. So they can have to do a lot more work of digging into the background. And talking to clients and customers without losing them, but doing the right thing. So some of what I've known Agile practitioners do particularly well is consult widely with all kinds of users to find out what's going to impact them if they make this change, if they try this. Who else needs to be asked about this? Who else is in the chain? Who's in the network? And winning heart, I mean, hand in hand with that goes winning hearts and minds of staff, stakeholders and shareholders. So these are their challenges. And it seems to me that Agile as a profession is perfectly placed to be a really strong ally and a champion in this. So where do you come in? Well, the hero over here on the left is a bit of a mess, isn't it? It's a higgledy-piggledy, rather risky set of electrical connections, and who would know what was what. And what you're very good at doing in Agile is making sense out of chaos, complexity. You're very good at looking more systemically than perhaps other parts of the business would do. Doesn't mean to say you're going to put everything in neat little boxes, but you know how to bring order, you know how to manage risk, you know how to do things incrementally so that you're building and building and building, and you're making things available and for people to use as resources rather than these absolute messes that you see there on the left. So this is where your skill set lies, and you've got the competency framework already in place. I don't need to go through that. But you've got that in place, and you can build on that by building through and thinking much more about sustainability and about the climate and the environment in everything you're doing. So some of your key skills: Agile knowledge and assessment, your coaching skills. You have open mindsets. You're taught to have open mindsets, and you're building on that all the time. And you also have some great visual management tools, and you know how to look at things on a daily basis as well as a larger basis. And so you're great at breaking things down into steps, as I said. Also, you know, creating rapport with business and leaders to find out what they need, what they don't want. And you're usually very good at self-management, to carrying on minimal supervision. I've often worked with Agile people who say, you know, once we found out what we need, we're going to go and do it, and then we'll take it back, and then we'll take. So there's you know, you don't need to be micromanaged. So you can be a massive asset to leaders and businesses in just those things alone. And the Academy of Executive Coaching, with whom I've trained as a climate conscious coach, has defined some key coaching skills here for climate. Systemic thinking. Hey, you've already got that. Coach as disruptor. You're often bringing in, introducing change. Behavior change. A lot of what you do helps people to change behaviors. You may not necessarily see yourself as a behavior change agent, but you are asking people to change the way they do things. Of course, you're helping them to adapt their behaviors, and sometimes you're adapting your services and offerings to their behaviors, but you are making behavioral change happen in your organizations. And insight and self-management. Well, you're very reflective. You're good at looking at what you've done well, what needs to change, what you do differently next time. So these are key skills that you can bring, and these can break down into much more smaller areas around, you know, confidence, around communication, around becoming emotionally intelligent, and respect, and all of those kind of things, and speaking credibly about what's going on in the world to help people to learn and understand. So I'd now like to ask you to go back to that first question of how concerned, I should mention just here your values of transparency. And these were values written by Exine and Buck in 2020, and I've got a reference to these around the values that need to be in place for Agile and sustainability to work in hand in hand. Transparency, self-organization, continuous learning, and a constant customer focus. So you're kind of ready-made for this work. If anyone was really lined up to do some of these challenging tasks, you're ready-made. So I'd like now to ask you, on that scale of 0 to 10, how concerned are you about climate change? And write down a number, and it might be different from the last one. It might be better, worse, doesn't really matter. And do you think we're doing enough, having looked at what I said about what's going on in the world and the level of extinctions and the extreme weather events that are happening? And would you like to do more? So some next steps for you. I think it's really useful to get clear on why this matters to you. Investing some time, make it personal. It was only when I was really personally impacted that I changed my life and made a commitment to me and everyone I deal with, that this matters and I'm going to do what I can. It's also useful to do a skills audit. If it's for yourself, where are your gaps in this? Or if you're a team leader, where are your team's gaps? And where are the opportunities around the business for you to help out? And that links very much is seeking out and setting up networks. It's not a time to be alone, it's a time to work and collaborate. So there's internal networks, who's already championing this, who's dealing with this stuff, and who's on the outside, externally, who's there. But what organizations can you hook up with? Seek out inspiring stories and signs of positive tipping points. It doesn't have to be doom and gloom. There are lots of great things happening and there's plenty of good stories. So find those as well, because part of your role will be inspiring people. And be challenging when needed, but be mindful of people's defenses. It's not something that you trample in on people about. Just be mindful that there's often good reasons they're not addressing this because they're feeling overwhelmed. Yeah, there will always be extreme climate deniers and you're never going to convert them. There's no point in wasting energy. But do challenge behaviours, but nicely when needed. Can we do this differently? What if we were to have the earth in mind as we thought about this challenge? What if we were to have the next generations in mind? What will this decision look like in 5 years' time? How will this impact our shareholders? How will this impact our ESGs? What will happen here? So start thinking about challenging in that way. And remove obstacles that prevent others from acting. If you're in a leadership role, then part of your job is to make it easier for people to do their job. So what's in the way? Is it skills? Is it knowledge? Is it confidence? Is it credibility? What is it that's in their way from them becoming climate champions as well? And do contact me if I can help you or your organisation to rise the challenge, whether that's coaching. I run open programmes on coaching skills for leaders and managers. I facilitate offsites. I do all sorts of things. I can come and talk to hundreds of people in your organisation about what their role could be. Whatever, if I can help, then please do contact me. And there's a poem I would like to leave you with, and it's by Margaret Atwood, and it's called The Moment. The moment when, after many years of hard work and a long voyage, you stand in the centre of your room, house, half acre, square mile, island, country, knowing at last how you got there, and say, I own this. It's the same moment when the trees unloose their soft arms from around you, the birds take back their language, the cliffs fissure and collapse, the air moves back from you like a wave, and you can't breathe. No, they whisper, you own nothing. You were a visitor time after time, climbing the hill, planting the flag, proclaiming, we never belonged to you. You never found us. It was always the other way round. Thank you. There are my contact details. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Well, thank you, Linda. It's incredibly powerful conversation, things that you've just brought there, and I feel quite overwhelmed by some of the topics. So thank you for that. And even just your starting point around nature is all around us. Often from my own experience, I think nature is only outside, but looking at my curtains, like you say, looking at the desk, it really is all around us. And I think that's made quite a big impact on the way that I'm viewing just my environment now, which is surprising. I didn't think that would happen, because I often feel that I'm fairly aware about how to become more sustainable and aware about how I live, but like you say, it's a different it's a different journey for all of us. So yeah, no, it's amazing. And just thinking a bit more about some of those things like the business sectors, and how actually that is the pivotal point, right? We can all make such a big difference in the places that we work. And in our conference today, I don't have the immediate figures, but we're expecting up to 10,000 people. And imagine if all of us took that step to make a small change, and then grow our knowledge and understand how we can make a difference within not only our businesses but in our personal life and everything around us. I really loved the way you talk about the issues. Obviously you talk about these problems that can be quite doom and gloom, and I've said it before, Ines and I talk about sustainability and sort of the eco-warrior side of things, and I often say it's all very doom and gloom. How can we bring a bit of hope to us? But actually, it's quite enlightening to hear from yourself, being a climate activist as well, around there's no judgment. We all start from somewhere, and actually it's okay to have your marker zero. that numbness, because it's such a massive topic. So on that subject, I'm wondering if I can just ask you one question, if that's okay. What has been your biggest challenge as a climate activist, and how can we as a community support you or support the things that you're doing more?
What a lovely question. Well, there's been so many. It's
yeah.
I think my biggest challenge was has and still is actually is trying very hard to stay compassionate to people who don't get it. And it's something I run climate cafes. These are places where people come online at the moment, mostly for me. They come from all around the world to talk about how they're feeling, because they can't talk about it at home because their families don't allow it, or their work doesn't allow it, or they feel it's taboo. And the thing that so many people echo is that they find it really hard to be around people who just think that it's not happening, because it's like being in a nightmare, they say. And I felt that when it's like being in a nightmare, and I want people to know that there's something we can do, and I want people to engage with it. But equally, I'm also massively mindful that it's very hard to engage with. So I think that's one of the challenges, is staying compassionate and not getting impatient, saying, oh, for goodness sake, can't you see it? Because that's also my human nature too. I have my frustrations. I think that would probably be it. I'm just thinking if there's another one, because there's so many. You did ask for one, but I just got another one that's bubbling now, and I'm just trying to think what it is. And I think it's actually dealing with the overwhelm. I think that's probably it. I first started talking about it when I had my butterfly moment. I did go into a manic defensive state when I realized, we really are in trouble. And I threw myself into so many things and got burnt out quite quickly. And one of the things I threw myself into was academia. I'm not a scientist, but I felt I needed to know lots to be credible and to get it and that kind of thing. And I think I've just come full circle now, and I've realized we've got to act urgently, but we've also got to take our time. It's a really weird paradox. We've got to, so and do what we can. So I think that's the challenge, is not get overwhelmed, but equally not let ourselves off the hook by saying, well, I do my bit, I recycle my plastic. It's not good enough. It's just not good enough. Not we need to think of our ancestors. A lovely thing that one leader I work with in an incredible organization, she has a candle in each board meeting and puts it in the middle of the table for the board and says that candle represents 7 generations ahead. It's called the 7th generation principle. And whatever decisions we make here today must have those 7 generations, the 7th generation in mind. How is what we do. So I think that I'd love to be able to think that what I'm doing right now will not be harmful to those generations down the line.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing. And we are coming to the end of our time. So Ines.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. Much food for thought to digest, and definitely a good call to actions to get us moving, because there's in time. And just like that, day 3 of the Agile Online Summit 2022 has officially begun. So thank you, Linda. We have very few seconds between now and the next session. So do please try to have a stretch, drink some water, check out which one of the next sessions are you going to join next. Don't forget to hop over the relevant Slack channel for that track. We'll see you there. Let's do this.